My parents drained $380,000 from me while calling it love, then laughed about it on a secret recording my sister sent as a joke. I didn't cry. I didn't confront them. I answered with one sentence that detonated their perfect family image in front of everyone watching, listening, judging silently. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Tessa Rowe, I'm 33, and I'm telling you up front that this story starts with a sound I can still hear in my skull like a dentist drill. My mother laughing about me like I was a coupon she clipped off the Sunday paper and kept in her wallet for emergencies. Not laughing because something was funny, laughing because she felt safe doing it, like cruelty was a family recipe and I was the ingredient nobody respected. 3 days ago, my younger sister, Betrayal, sent me an audio file with a little smirk message that said, "Guess who has a surprise for you?" And the file was exactly 4 minutes and 23 seconds long, which is a weirdly specific amount of time to ruin someone's entire childhood. But here we are. I was at work when it came in, and I need you to picture the scene because it matters. I'm on the 47th floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of office that smells like expensive coffee and quiet fear, the kind of place where people pretend they're calm while their stomachs are eating themselves alive. I'm staring at quarterly projections for a private equity firm called Lakefront Ridge Partners, my name on a door that still doesn't feel real, lead analyst in crisp black letters, and my phone lights up with Brielle's name. Normally, I would have smiled. Normally, I would have assumed she wanted to gossip about some guy or ask me to Venmo her for just one thing. Normally, I would have been the reliable one without even thinking about it because being reliable was how I bought love in my family. It was my subscription plan. But that night, for whatever reason, my thumb hovered over the file like my body knew it was poison. And I still pressed play. Because I was still that version of me, the one who believed family loyalty was a virtue, not a trap. I want you to understand what my life looked like from the outside before you judge me for what I did next, because people love judging the responsible one, right up until they need her wallet. On paper, I'm doing great. 6-figure salary, senior title, neat little LinkedIn profile, polite smile, and a professional headshot. In reality, my bank account had been bleeding out for 8 years into my parents' life, like I was a silent sponsor, and they were a charity with bad morals. It started the way all cons start. Small, urgent, emotional. 8 years ago, 3 weeks after I got my first real finance job, my mother called sobbing about a car repair. "We're stranded," she said. "We don't know what we'll do." I sent $500 in under 5 minutes and felt proud, like I'd finally earned my place in the family. That's what they don't tell you about being the family fixer. You think you're buying your way into love, but you're really training them to treat you like an appliance. That $500 became $1,000 the next month. Then it became $2,400 every month for their mortgage out in Naperville, because apparently their home was all of us, even though my name wasn't on the deed, wasn't on the mailbox, wasn't on anything except the payments. Then came Brielle's tuition at a private college, the kind of tuition that makes you feel like you've been punched when you see the numbers, and I paid it because my mother kept saying, "You don't want your sister to struggle, do you?" Like struggle was a choice, and I was the gatekeeper. Then came my father's early retirement because his back was too bad, which, listen, I'm not here to mock someone's pain, but I am here to tell you there's a difference between needing help and turning your own kid into a funding source while you maintain a lifestyle you can't afford. My friends were buying condos. My coworkers were traveling. I was renewing the lease on my tiny studio, telling myself I'd save next year like next year was a real place. I kept saying, it's temporary. But it wasn't temporary to them. It was a business model. And the wild part is I didn't even question it because I was raised like this, like love is performance-based, like affection is earned through sacrifice, like being a good daughter means your own comfort comes dead last. If you've lived that, you already know what I mean. It's like you're born holding a receipt you didn't ask for, and your parents keep adding charges to it until you're paying interest on guilt. So Tuesday night at 9:47 p.m., I hit play on Brielle's file, expecting maybe some dumb family video or a birthday montage for our parents' anniversary, because that's what we had coming up. My mother had been planning her 35th wedding anniversary party, like she was planning the Oscars. Oakbrook Hills Country Club. White tablecloths. Crystal chandeliers. 85 guests. The whole church circle. The old neighbors. My father's retired union buddies. People who only ever saw my parents as solid and good and community. And I was supposed to be the shining daughter in the spotlight, the proof that they raised us right. 2 weeks earlier, I noticed a charge on my credit card. Liberty Travel, $28,450. I called my mother, thinking it was fraud. She laughed like it was cute. Surprise, she said. You're sending us to Europe for our anniversary. We already told everyone. Isn't that sweet? Imagine hearing that and not immediately losing your mind. I didn't lose my mind because my family trained me not to. I froze, like my brain did that thing where it tries to protect you by going numb. I remember staring at my kitchen sink, looking at a single spoon, thinking, why is she talking like this is normal? And then I did what I always did. I swallowed it. I told myself I'd deal with it later. I told myself, it's family. That phrase has ruined more lives than bad credit. Then I listened to the file. The audio sounded like it was recorded in my parents' kitchen because I recognized the sound of their old refrigerator hum, that low grind they keep complaining about but never replace. You know how your childhood home has a sound? Like the walls have a signature? That hum was it. The recording started with dishes clinking, then my mother's voice came in, light as air, like she was describing a movie she didn't like. She really thinks we love her. And then she laughed. Not a little giggle, not an awkward laugh, a comfortable laugh. My chest got tight so fast it felt like someone cinched a belt around my ribs. Then my father chuckled, the same chuckle I grew up hearing at barbecues when he told stories, except this time it had teeth. Well, she's always been the naive one. And then Betrayal, my sister, my best friend's sister, the one I defended, the one I paid for, the one I kept excusing, she said, how long do you think she'll keep paying? Like I was a subscription, like I was Netflix. And my mother answered without hesitation, no guilt, no pause, like she'd rehearsed it. As long as she believes we need her. That's her weakness. She needs to feel needed. Then more laughter, the kind that makes you realize this isn't new, this is who they are when you're not in the room. I stopped it before the end because I couldn't breathe. I sat on my bed in my tiny studio. The Chicago skyline glowing through one window like a postcard I wasn't allowed to step into, and I just stared at the wall. No tears yet. Just this slow, disgusting math happening in my head. All those transfers, all those emergencies, all those months I said no to myself so I could say yes to them, and this is how they talked about me when they thought they were safe. The next message came in from Betrayal. Did you listen? Like she'd just sent me a meme. Like it was entertainment. Like she expected me to spiral and beg and apologize for existing. I stared at her text, and for the first time in my life, my fingers typed something without asking permission for my fear. I wrote 4 words. So do I. And I sent it. That line was not some dramatic revenge speech. It was a switch flipping. It was me saying, I heard you, and I'm not going back to sleep. I didn't sleep that night. I did what I always do when life gets scary. I turned it into data. I listened to the recording again, then again, and I took notes like an auditor. Timestamp. Voices. Exact words. Laugh breaks. The way my mother said love like a joke. Then I opened my bank app, and I started scrolling. 8 years of transactions. And this is where the story becomes less sad daughter and more, you picked the wrong woman to play with, because I work in finance. Numbers are my language. Receipts are my religion. I built a spreadsheet at 1:06 a.m. like I was preparing a case for court, because in my head, that's exactly what it was, a case against my own denial. Mortgage payments, $230,400. Tuition, $78,000. Living expenses for my parents, $47,300. Random emergencies that were never repaid, $28,500. Total, $384,200. When that total popped up, I actually laughed once, but it was the kind of laugh you do when you realize you've been robbed politely. $384,200, and I still had a studio apartment with thin walls and a neighbor who practiced saxophone at 2 a.m. Meanwhile, my sister was posting brunch photos, my mother was hosting book club, my father was resting his back, And all of it was funded by my need to be loved. That's the part people don't understand until they've lived it. Financial betrayal doesn't just steal money, it steals time, it steals choices, it steals the future you were building quietly in the background. At around 3 a.m., I emailed my best friend, Maya Alvarez, who is a lawyer and the kind of woman who does not soften her words to make liars comfortable. Subject line: I need you. It's bad. She replied 12 minutes later. Coffee. 8 a.m. Intelligentsia. Bring everything. I turned my phone off after that. I didn't want any more texts from Betrayal. I didn't want my mother's voice. I wanted one clean moment where my brain could think, without being guilt-tripped. Wednesday morning, I went to coffee with Maya like a woman walking into a war meeting. She listened to the audio, without blinking. When it ended, she didn't say, "But they're your family." She didn't say, "Maybe it was taken out of context." She didn't say, "Try to talk it out." She said, "This is exploitation. Period." Then she checked the metadata, verified it wasn't edited, and said the two most beautiful words you can hear when you've been gaslit your whole life. It's admissible. That's when I realized the real weapon wasn't my anger. The weapon was proof. The weapon was calm. Because people like my mother survive on emotional chaos. If you scream, she calls you unstable. If you cry, she calls you dramatic. If you argue, she calls you disrespectful. But if you show up with receipts and a steady voice, she has nothing to hide behind. So I did 3 things quietly, with the same energy I used to approve a budget line item at work. I froze my credit card. I canceled the vacation. I stopped the monthly transfer. And I need you to understand how insane that felt because I didn't just stop paying a bill, I stopped playing a role. It's like your whole life you've been the family's oxygen machine, keeping everyone breathing, and the moment you unplug it you expect alarms, guilt, lightning from heaven, a swarm of relatives screaming, "How could you?" And yes, some of that did come, but first there was something else. Silence. A weird, stunned silence, like they couldn't believe the ATM had legs. At 8:47 a.m. my phone buzzed with a decline notification. Nordstrom, card ending 4721, declined. Betrayal tried to use my card. Immediately. Like a rat pressing a lever for food. And in that moment, I want you to picture me at my desk in a sleek office with glass walls and quiet coworkers, staring at a decline notification like it was a little poem. Because I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. If you're watching this and you've ever been trained to feel guilty for protecting yourself, you know how rare that clarity is. It's like the fog lifts and you can finally see the cliff you've been walking toward. Midway through all this, I have to ask you something because I know I'm not the only one living this movie in different costumes. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What time is it where you are? And are you the responsible one in your family too? The one who always pays, always fixes, always absorbs the mess so everyone else can pretend they're fine? Because I want to know how many of us are sitting here nodding like, yep, that's my life. And if you don't want to comment, at least say it out loud to yourself, because naming it is the first crack in the cage. Anyway, Thursday afternoon my mother called. Sweet voice first, like honey poured over a knife. Is something wrong with your card? Betrayal said it declined. Notice she didn't ask if I was okay. She asked about access. That's how you know what you are to someone. I told her calmly. I froze it. 3 seconds of silence, then the tone shift, and if you grew up with a mother like mine you know the shift. It's the temperature drop in the room when you disappointed the queen. Right before our anniversary, she asked like I'd canceled Christmas. Then she said the line that should be engraved on the tombstone of toxic families everywhere. Don't be dramatic, it's family. What's yours is ours. And for the first time, I said it back without shaking. What's mine is mine. She hung up like I slapped her. Then Betrayal FaceTimed me from my childhood bedroom like she owned it, lounging against pillows, doing that fake casual thing people do when they're actually nervous. She said, "You're causing a stir," with a smile like she wanted to watch the fire. I asked her why she sent me the recording. And she said with a shrug, "Honestly, I wanted to see what you'd do. You're always so perfect." Then she threatened me like it was nothing, said my mother would call my CFO and tell him I was having a mental breakdown if I didn't fall back in line by Sunday. That's when I did something that shocked even me. I started recording. And later, when my mother called and tried to blackmail my career, I asked her one question that made her choke on her own power. Are you recording this conversation, Mom? She hesitated, and I said, because I am. Silence. Pure, shocked silence. You know what that silence was? That was the moment she realized her favorite puppet had scissors. By Sunday morning, the club had the banner up, the chandeliers were sparkling, 85 guests were ready to clap, and my mother expected me to walk in, smile, and hand over the Europe trip like a trained poodle. She didn't know the trip was canceled. She didn't know the card was frozen. She didn't know I had a folder full of numbers and a sound file full of her laugh. She thought she still controlled the narrative. And here's the part that's going to make you either cheer or clutch your pearls depending on which kind of family you came from. I didn't want to win by being the loudest. I wanted to win by being undeniable. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the people she'd been performing for to finally see the backstage. So I asked my neighbor, a calm, decent guy named Jonah, to come with me as a +1 because I needed someone in the room who wasn't hypnotized by my mother's image. Jonah agreed without questions, and before we left he handed me a business card for a therapist and said, not because you're broken, but because this leaves marks. That sentence hit me harder than the recording did because it was the first time someone acknowledged the damage without asking me to minimize it. So Sunday at 5:45 p.m., I walked into Oakbrook Hills Country Club in a simple navy dress, holding a red folder like it was a heartbeat. The ballroom was gorgeous. I'll give my mother that. She can decorate a lie like nobody's business. White tablecloths. Crystal chandeliers. That big smug banner. 35 years of love. My mother stood at the entrance greeting guests, pearls on her neck, smile on her face, playing the role of devoted wife and loving mother, and when she saw me she hugged me tight and whispered into my ear, "You embarrass me tonight, and I will destroy you." And I smiled into her shoulder and whispered back, "You've been doing that for 8 years. Tonight, I'm just telling people about it." She released me with that frozen smile people wear when their mask is cracking but they can't let anyone see. My sister was in a white dress at her table like she was auditioning for Innocent Victim of Mean Big Sister, and my father sat at the head table like a king who forgot the kingdom was funded by someone he called naive. The event coordinator tapped the microphone and announced me. Tessa Rowe, the couple's eldest daughter, will say a few words and present a special gift. Applause rolled across the room. Warm, clueless applause. And I walked toward the stage knowing that in about 60 seconds, the room would split into two kinds of people. The ones who believed family loyalty means silence, and the ones who finally understood that silence is how this kind of theft survives. My hand touched the microphone, cool metal, spotlight warm on my face, and I looked out at 85 mouths ready to smile for photos, and I realized something that made my stomach flip in a way that wasn't fear anymore, it was power. My mother's whole world was built on everyone agreeing not to say what they knew, and I was about to say it out loud with proof. And once a room hears the truth in surround sound, you can't stuff it back into a whisper. I opened the red folder. I looked straight at my mother's face, and I started with the calmest sentence I've ever said in my life, the kind of sentence that sounds polite right up until it lands like a brick, and that's when my sister's phone slid off the table with a clatter because she realized the surprise she sent me wasn't a joke anymore. It was evidence. I want you to feel the temperature of that room the moment my mouth opened because it wasn't dramatic silence. It was that thick, electric quiet where people sense something is about to go wrong but don't yet know for who, and I let it stretch just long enough to make everyone lean in before I said thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for celebrating my parents. 35 years is a long time to stay married, and I grew up watching them build what looked like stability, routine, tradition. And I saw my mother's shoulders loosen just a fraction because she thought I was following the script she wrote for me like I always did. And that's when I pivoted because pivots are my specialty. I do them for a living. I said, instead of giving you a sentimental speech about love, I want to talk about support because that's what this family prides itself on, supporting each other. And head started nodding. People love hearing words they already agree with. I said 8 years ago when I got my first real job, I was excited to finally give back, to finally be useful. To finally stop feeling like the extra piece in the family puzzle, and you could see recognition on a few faces. The responsible daughter trope is familiar to everyone. I said my parents needed help with the mortgage, my sister needed tuition, emergencies kept happening, and I was happy to help because family helps family, right? I paused, I smiled. I let them say yes in their heads. And then I said, I was curious recently. So I did the math, and this is where the room shifted because numbers change things. Emotions are debatable. Numbers are not. I said over 8 years I gave my family $384,200, and the air left the room like someone popped a balloon. Forks froze midair. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. Someone near the back actually said what out loud before they could stop themselves. My mother took one step toward the stage, and my father's face went that weird color men get when they realize control is slipping. I didn't rush. I flipped open the folder slowly because pacing matters. I said that breaks down to $2,400 a month for the mortgage, which comes out to $230,400, $78,000 for my sister's college tuition, $47,300 in so-called living expenses, and another $28,500 in emergencies that were never repaid, and now people weren't nodding anymore, they were staring, doing mental math, comparing that number to their own lives. Realizing this wasn't casual help, this was a financial transfusion. My mother finally snapped and said loudly, "This is inappropriate." And I said calmly, "I agree," which is why I never wanted it to be public. I wanted it to be honest, and that honesty came at a cost. I looked directly at her then and said, "Last week I learned what that cost bought me," and I held up my phone, and here is where I want you to understand something important. If you've ever dealt with someone who manipulates perception, the truth isn't powerful because it's loud. It's powerful because it's undeniable. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't accuse, I pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the ballroom saying she really thinks we love her. What we love is her money. And you could physically feel 85 people process the same shock at the same time. It's like a wave hits a beach. People jerked back. Some looked at my mother, some at me, some at my sister, whose face drained of color like someone pulled a plug. My father's laugh came next on the recording, calling me naive. And that laugh sounded uglier in a room full of witnesses than it ever did in a kitchen where they thought no one was listening. I stopped the audio before the full 4 minutes, because I didn't need to finish it. The damage was already done. My mother screamed, "Turn that off, it's fake. She's having an episode." And that's when I realized something that still chills me. This wasn't the first time she'd tried to label me unstable. It was just the first time she'd done it in front of people who didn't know her loyalty. I said, "It's not fake. The metadata shows it was recorded last Sunday at 2:34 p.m. It's been reviewed by legal counsel." And then I did something I didn't plan, but my body did for me. I looked at my sister and asked, "Would you like to explain who recorded it and why you sent it to me?" And that question landed harder than any accusation could have. Because now the room wasn't watching a daughter rebel, they were watching a sister exposed. My sister opened her mouth, closed it, tears started falling, and for a split second I felt something old and dangerous rise in me. The instinct to protect her even now, even after everything. But I didn't interrupt the moment, because moments like that are how patterns break. My uncle stood up and asked my mother, "Is this true?" And she said, "It's complicated," which is the word liars use when the truth is simple but damning. My grandmother spoke from her chair in a voice so calm it cut through the chaos and said, "You told me she insisted on paying. You told me she felt guilty," and my mother snapped at her to stay out of it. And that's when I knew I'd crossed the point of no return, because you can't unhear that kind of truth, and you can't unsee who people protect when the mask slips. I closed the folder and said, "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to stop participating. No more monthly transfers, no more emergencies, no more credit cards used without permission. And I need you to understand this wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. And boundaries feel like betrayal to people who benefit from your lack of them." I walked off that stage with my legs shaking but my head clear, and the room exploded behind me into whispers and raised voices and chairs scraping back. My mother called after me that I was destroying the family, and I said without turning around, "No, I'm telling the truth about it." Outside, the air felt cold and clean, like my lungs had been underwater for years, and finally broke the surface. Jonah walked beside me without saying a word, which is exactly what I needed, because commentary would have broken me. In the parking lot, my grandmother followed as fast as she could and told me quietly, "You were brave, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." And I hugged her, knowing that apology meant more than all the fake ones that would come later. On the drive home, Jonah asked how I felt, and I said, like, I just stopped holding up a building that wasn't mine. And that night in my apartment, I cried not because I'd embarrassed them, but because I finally saw the truth clearly enough to grieve it. And that grief wasn't just about money, it was about the fantasy that if I gave enough, I'd eventually earn unconditional love. The aftermath hit fast and messy. My phone filled with messages from relatives who suddenly wanted clarification. My mother posted vague quotes about family betrayal and privacy. My sister texted that I'd ruined her life. My father went silent, which somehow hurt more than his laughter. But something else happened too that no one warns you about when you finally say no. The world got bigger. My bank account stopped bleeding. My mind stopped racing. My future stopped being postponed. And the scariest part wasn't losing them, it was realizing how much of myself I'd already lost trying to keep them comfortable. And as the days passed and the noise settled, I started to understand the real lesson hiding under all this drama. Love that requires payment isn't love, it's rent. And I'd been paying top dollar for a place I was never allowed to feel safe in. And the next choice I made wasn't loud or public or explosive. It was quiet and terrifying and permanent, because once you stop funding a lie, you have to figure out what's real. And that's when the real reckoning began. Not for them, but for me, because cutting off the money was easy compared to cutting off the belief that my worth was tied to what I could provide. And the next thing I did forced me to face that belief head on in a way I couldn't spreadsheet my way out of. And it changed the direction of my life in a way no one in that ballroom could have predicted. The morning after the party didn't feel victorious or dramatic. It felt quiet in a way that scared me, because silence is where all the thoughts you've been postponing finally line up and demand answers. I woke up before my alarm, and for a split second my body reached for panic like muscle memory, because for 8 years the first thought in my head every morning was who needs me today, and how much is it going to cost? And when that thought didn't arrive, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to understand who I was without that role. My phone was face down on the nightstand because I'd learned the hard way that nothing good comes from checking it too early after you detonate a family illusion in front of witnesses. I eventually picked it up anyway because avoidance has a shelf life, and I needed to see the damage. 47 missed calls. Texts stacked so deep they blurred together. My mother's name repeating like a jump scare. My sister's messages swinging wildly between rage and victimhood. Relatives suddenly discovering my number after years of silence. And buried in all that noise were 3 messages that stopped me cold. One from my CFO asking if everything was okay, because he'd received a very strange voicemail expressing concern about my mental state. One from a colleague saying, "Hey, I heard some weird stuff, are you alright?" And one from an unknown number that simply said, "You embarrassed us. And this isn't over." That's when it hit me that the confrontation wasn't the climax, it was the opening move. The real game was about to start, and this time the battlefield wasn't a ballroom, it was my career, my reputation, my sanity. And here's where I want you to pause for a second, because if you've ever stood up to someone who benefits from your silence, you already know this part. The retaliation never comes where you expect it. It comes where you're vulnerable. And for me, that was work. The one place I'd always kept separate from family drama. The place I thought was safe. I didn't spiral though, and that surprised me. Instead, I did something very uncharacteristic. I made a list, not an emotional list, but a practical one. What could they realistically do? And what proof did I have to counter it? Because fear shrinks when you force it into bullet points. I emailed my CFO directly and asked for a meeting. I forwarded the voicemail without commentary and said I wanted to address it head on. And when we sat down later that afternoon, he didn't look suspicious or concerned. He looked irritated on my behalf. He said, "I've known you for 6 years. You've never missed a deadline or a commitment. Do you want to tell me what's going on, or do you want me to ignore this completely?" And that was the first moment I realized something important that I wish someone had told me sooner. Manipulative people rely on you assuming everyone else will believe them the way you were trained to. But most adults can smell nonsense when it's not coming from inside. The family bubble. I told him the short version: financial exploitation, boundaries, backlash. He nodded once and said documented. Then he leaned back and said, "If anyone contacts us again, we'll route it to legal. Focus on your work." And just like that, one of my biggest fears dissolved, because it was built on an old childhood script that said authority figures always side with my parents. That script didn't apply anymore, but my nervous system hadn't gotten the memo. The rest of that week felt like walking through aftershocks. Relatives choosing sides. Stories mutating. My mother framing herself as a heartbroken martyr who sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. My sister leaning hard into the narrative that I'd stolen her future by cutting off support. and me sitting in my apartment realizing that if I didn't consciously rewrite my internal rules, I'd end up folding just to make the noise stop. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because the temptation to go back was real, not because I doubted the truth, but because loneliness is persuasive. It whispers, maybe you overreacted, maybe you could compromise, maybe just help a little. And I caught myself opening my banking app one night out of sheer habit, my thumb hovering where the transfer button used to be, and that's when I understood how deep the conditioning ran. Money wasn't just money in my family, it was how affection was expressed and withdrawn, it was how peace was bought. And stopping the transfers felt like emotional withdrawal. My body reacted like an addict cut off from supply, tight chest, racing thoughts, guilt so sharp it almost felt like nausea. I want to know if this sounds familiar to you, so pause the video for a second and tell me where you're watching from right now, because I know this isn't just my story. People all over the world are carrying this exact weight in different currencies and different families. Drop your city or country in the comments, because I want you to see how many of us are here together. What grounded me in those moments wasn't willpower, it was clarity. I kept replaying my mother's voice from that recording, not to punish myself, but to anchor myself in reality. Whenever the guilt crept in, I asked one simple question: would someone who loves me say that about me when they think I can't hear? And the answer snapped me back every time. A few days later, I did something that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I walked into a real estate office. I didn't announce it on social media or tell anyone in my family. I just sat across from an agent and said, I want to see what my options look like if my money stays mine. She pulled up numbers, projections, mortgage scenarios, and as she talked, I felt something loosen in my chest, because for the first time my future wasn't theoretical, it was visible. And that visibility came with grief, because I could see all the years I delayed this moment, waiting for permission I was never going to get. That night I met Jonah and Rebecca for dinner and told them everything I'd been holding back. Not just the logistics, but the ugly thoughts. The part of me that still wanted my mother to call and say she was sorry. The part of me that worried I was becoming the villain she painted me as. Rebecca listened and said something that rewired my brain. She said, you're confusing discomfort with wrongdoing. They're not the same thing. Growth feels like betrayal to people who benefited from you staying small. And that sentence lodged itself somewhere deep, because it explained why doing the right thing felt so wrong. The fallout didn't stop there. My sister sent a long message accusing me of destroying the family, listing every sacrifice our parents made, framing my childhood as a debt I was now refusing to pay. And for the first time I read it without defending myself. I saw it for what it was: an invoice for love that was never unconditional. I didn't respond immediately. I let it sit, because urgency is another manipulation tool. And when I did reply, it was brief and calm and final. I said, I'm not responsible for how you feel about boundaries I set to protect myself. I hope you find independence, but it won't come from me. And then I blocked her. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because healing doesn't happen in the middle of ongoing harm. My mother escalated next. She sent messages to extended family warning them I was unstable. She hinted at stress, leave, and burnout. She weaponized concern the way she always did. And here's the twist she didn't expect. People started asking questions, not out loud at first, but privately, because the math didn't add up. The generous daughter suddenly snapping, the recorded audio circulating quietly among relatives, the bank transfers that no one knew existed. Cracks formed in the story she'd curated for decades, and I learned something uncomfortable but validating. Lies rely on maintenance. Truth just waits. The hardest moment came about 2 weeks after the party, when my father called. He'd always been the quieter one, the enabler rather than the architect, and his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. He didn't apologize right away. He talked around it, about stress and misunderstandings and how your mother didn't mean it like that, and I stopped him. I said, I'm not asking you to mediate or explain her behavior. I need to know one thing: do you believe what she said on that recording? And there was a long pause, the kind that tells you everything before words arrive. He said yes, and I said, then we can't move forward until that's acknowledged. And for the first time in my life, he didn't argue. He just said, I understand, and we hung up. It wasn't closure, but it was honesty, and that felt like progress. Weeks passed, then months. The noise slowly dulled. My bank account stabilized, my sleep improved, my anxiety flared less often, and something unexpected happened. I started to enjoy my life in small, quiet ways. Cooking real meals, making plans without checking my balance first, imagining a future that didn't involve constant crisis management. And that's when the second reckoning arrived, the internal one, because when you remove the chaos, you also remove the excuse. I couldn't say I was too busy helping my family anymore. I had to face my own desires, my own fears, my own patterns of self-abandonment. Therapy helped. Not because it told me I was right, but because it asked better questions like, why did being needed feel safer than being loved? Why did I equate sacrifice with virtue? Why was no one ever allowed to owe me? Those questions didn't have neat answers, but they had power, and power is what shifts dynamics. The last piece of this chapter came quietly one evening when I realized I hadn't thought about sending money in weeks. The habit had finally broken, and in that space something new was forming. Confidence not built on approval but on alignment, and that confidence scared the people who used to control me more than any confrontation ever could, because it meant I wasn't reacting anymore, I was choosing, and the next choice I made was the biggest one yet, one that would permanently change my relationship to my past, and force the people who underestimated me to see that cutting me off financially didn't weaken me, it freed me. And when that happened, the story took a turn none of us saw coming. The decision didn't come with fireworks or a dramatic announcement. It came disguised as a practical step, the kind of step people like me were trained to take quietly, responsibly, without applause. But this one carried a different weight, because it wasn't about fixing a problem, it was about building something that had never existed before: independence without apology. And the moment I signed my name on those preliminary condo documents, I felt something shift that no argument or confrontation had managed to do. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was creating. And creation is terrifying when you've spent your whole life managing other people's emergencies, because it leaves no room to hide behind usefulness. Suddenly, every choice reflected back at me with one brutal question: what do you want? Not what do they need, or what will keep the peace, or what will stop the calls. Just what do you want? And that question followed me everywhere over the next few weeks. Into meetings at work where I noticed how often I'd minimized my ideas, into friendships where I'd overextended myself just to feel secure, into late nights alone where the quiet no longer felt empty but exposed. And here's the thing no one tells you about breaking free from family control. The guilt doesn't disappear, it mutates. It becomes more subtle, more intellectual. It shows up as doubt, as second-guessing, as intrusive thoughts like, maybe you misunderstood the recording, maybe everyone says things they don't mean, maybe you should have handled it privately. And every time that loop started, I reminded myself of one grounding fact: if the truth needs to be hidden to preserve a relationship, then the relationship isn't safe. And safety isn't optional. Around that time, my mother tried a different tactic. Not rage, not threats, not martyrdom, but nostalgia. She sent photos from my childhood with captions like, remember when you were little, and needed us remember family vacations, remember Sunday dinners. And I won't lie, that one almost worked, because memory is a powerful drug and she knew exactly which veins to tap. But I noticed what wasn't there in those messages. No accountability, no acknowledgement of harm, no curiosity about my experience. Just an attempt to pull me back into a role where I was easier to control. And that's when I understood something critical: manipulation isn't always loud. Sometimes it's soft and sentimental and wrapped in shared history. Sometimes it sounds like love. And that realization didn't make me cold, it made me precise. I stopped engaging emotionally and started responding structurally. Short replies, neutral tone, no justifications. And the more consistent I was, the more erratic she became, because inconsistency is how control is regained, and I wasn't offering it anymore. Meanwhile, my sister went silent, which was its own form of pressure, silence designed to make me feel abandoned and responsible for fixing it. And for a moment I did feel it, that familiar itch to chase, to explain, to repair, but I resisted because I knew chasing would only confirm the narrative that I needed them more than they needed me. And something interesting happened when I stopped chasing. Other people started stepping closer. Co-workers inviting me to lunch, friends asking deeper questions, even neighbors I barely knew striking up conversations. It was like my life had room for connection now that it wasn't monopolized by crisis management. And that's when I started writing, not publicly at first, just in a private document where I unloaded everything I'd never been allowed to say. The resentment, the grief, the dark thoughts, like wondering if my parents would still love me if I lost my job and couldn't pay anymore. The shame of realizing part of me believed my value was transactional. Writing gave those thoughts somewhere to go so they didn't rot inside me. And one night, after hours of typing, I reread everything and noticed a pattern. Every memory that hurt involved silence on my end and control on theirs. Every memory that felt good involved honesty and mutual respect. That pattern was my compass. It told me which direction to keep walking even when the terrain got rough. And it Did get rough when extended family began choosing sides more openly. Invitations stopped coming from some relatives while others reached out cautiously asking for my version of events, and I answered honestly without oversharing because clarity doesn't require spectacle. And what surprised me was how many people admitted they'd always suspected something was off but didn't know how to name it. That was both validating and infuriating because it meant I wasn't crazy, and I also wasn't protected. I'd been the easiest solution, so everyone looked the other way, and that realization sparked a kind of controlled anger, not explosive, but focused, the kind that fuels boundaries instead of burning bridges. And I used that energy to do something bold. I redirected the money I used to send my parents into my own future, automatic transfers into savings, retirement, investments, things I'd postponed for years. And watching those accounts grow felt like reclaiming stolen time. Each deposit was a quiet rebellion, a reminder that my labor belonged to me. Around then, my father reached out again, asking to meet. And this time I agreed, because I'd learned the difference between reconciliation and re-entry. We met in a public place, neutral territory, no nostalgia cues, and he looked exhausted, like a man who'd spent decades outsourcing responsibility and was finally facing the bill. He didn't defend my mother this time. He didn't minimize or reframe. He just listened while I spoke uninterrupted for the first time in my life. I told him how it felt to be the family bank, how every call triggered anxiety, how love felt conditional. And when I finished, he said something simple and devastating. I didn't stop her, because it was easier to let you carry it than to confront her. And that sentence hurt more than any insult because it confirmed what I'd always feared: I was sacrificed for convenience. But it also freed me because clarity replaces hope with truth, and truth is easier to live with. We didn't resolve everything that day, but we established a new rule. If we were going to have a relationship, it would be separate from my mother's influence. No triangulation, no financial involvement, no guilt-based appeals. He agreed, and for the first time I believed him, because he wasn't asking me to save him, he was asking me to know him. That distinction matters. Not long after that, I found the condo. 2 bedrooms, sunlight spilling across exposed brick, a balcony overlooking a tree-lined street, and standing there during the showing, I felt something close to grief for the version of me who thought this kind of stability was selfish or unrealistic. I'd been living in survival mode so long that dreaming felt dangerous, and signing those papers wasn't just a financial milestone, it was an identity shift. I was no longer the backup plan, the emergency fund, the silent provider. I was a person with a life that extended beyond obligation, and when my mother found out through the grapevine, she lost it, accusing me of flaunting success, of abandoning family, of choosing strangers over blood. And instead of defending myself, I asked one question: do you want a relationship with me or with my money? She didn't answer. She pivoted, accused, deflected, and that non-answer was all the confirmation I needed. I didn't block her, but I stopped responding, because sometimes the boundary is absence, and absence speaks louder than arguments. As the months went on, something else shifted: my self-trust. Decisions became easier, my nervous system calmer. I stopped over-explaining and started expecting respect as a baseline. And with that shift came an unexpected opportunity at work, a leadership role that required decisiveness and confidence, qualities I'd been suppressing to stay agreeable. And when my manager offered it, I accepted without hesitation, because I finally believed I deserved it. And here's where the story twists again, because success has a way of exposing unresolved dynamics. My mother resurfaced, not with apologies, but with renewed interest. Suddenly proud, suddenly supportive, suddenly claiming credit. And that's when I understood something critical about people who exploit you: they don't miss you, they miss access. And denying access is the only language they understand. I maintained distance and focused on my growth. And in that space, I began sharing parts of my story anonymously online, not to shame my family, but to process my experience. And the response was overwhelming: messages from people who'd lived the same pattern, different details, same wound, people thanking me for articulating what they couldn't name. And that's when the narrative expanded beyond me. This wasn't just my reckoning, it was a mirror for thousands of others trapped in transactional families, and that responsibility grounded me, because it reframed my pain as something with purpose. And just when I thought the dust was settling, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text, a physical letter in my mother's handwriting, old school, deliberate. And inside was a carefully constructed plea, half apology, half justification, asking for a fresh start without conditions, while listing all the ways I'd hurt her. And reading it, I felt calm, not angry, not tempted, just clear, because growth teaches you discernment. I saw the pattern immediately: accountability without responsibility, remorse without repair, and I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, but because I was protecting myself, and that silence wasn't empty, it was full of intention. Full of the life I was building, full of the realization that I no longer needed validation from people who couldn't see me. And as I sat in my new living room one evening surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, I realized this chapter wasn't about revenge or even justice, it was about authorship. I was finally writing my own story instead of editing someone else's script, and the next step I took would make that authorship public in a way I never planned, drawing attention I didn't seek and forcing conversations I couldn't avoid, because when you stop hiding the truth, it has a way of finding an audience, whether you're ready or not. What happened next wasn't explosive, it was surgical, the kind of quiet escalation that only looks calm on the surface but underneath is rearranging everything, because once the truth had been spoken out loud, even partially, even imperfectly, it stopped being something I could tuck away and survive around. It demanded consistency, and consistency is dangerous to systems built on your silence. So I leaned into it, not dramatically, not with speeches, but with decisions that stacked one on top of the other until the weight of them became undeniable. I changed beneficiaries on my accounts. I updated emergency contacts. I removed shared access points I hadn't even realized were still there, because when you've been conditioned to overgive, you forget how many doors you've left unlocked. And each change came with a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief because the threat was shrinking. Grief because I was finally accepting that the people who should have protected me never would, and that acceptance hurt more than confrontation ever did, because confrontation still holds hope. Acceptance is final. Around this time, my writing stopped being private. Not intentionally at first, but because the thoughts had nowhere else to go. I posted one entry anonymously about financial boundaries and parental entitlement, and within hours the comments flooded in. Strangers describing their own versions of being the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who always pays and never complains, and reading those stories did something unexpected. It removed the isolation, because abuse wrapped in family language thrives on isolation. It convinces you that you're the only one, that everyone else handles it better, that your reaction is excessive. But suddenly there were thousands of voices saying, no, this pattern is real, and it's destructive. And that validation didn't inflate my ego, it steadied me. It reminded me that what I experienced wasn't a personal failure, it was a systemic dynamic, and once you see a system, you can dismantle it piece by piece. My mother noticed the shift before I ever told her directly. Manipulators always do. She commented less but watched more, probing through relatives, asking about my life, my finances, my plans. And every time she reached out indirectly, I refused to fill in the blanks, because information is currency, and I'd stopped funding her economy. Then one afternoon while I was at work, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was her, a new tactic. The text read, "I just want to understand why you hate me now." And there it was, the reframing, pain converted into accusation, accountability flipped into victimhood. And I stared at that message longer than I care to admit, because it poked at the oldest wound, the fear of being cruel for choosing myself. But instead of responding emotionally, I responded structurally. I wrote back, "I don't hate you, I'm choosing distance because our relationship has been harmful to me." And that sentence felt revolutionary, because it didn't invite debate, it didn't explain, it didn't apologize. It stated a fact and left it standing. She didn't reply immediately, which told me it landed, because confusion is what happens when your usual levers stop working. In the weeks that followed, my sister resurfaced, not with remorse but with resentment, accusing me of blowing everything up, of embarrassing the family, of ruining opportunities. And what struck me wasn't the anger, it was the entitlement underneath it. The assumption that my role was to absorb consequences meant for others, and when I didn't, she experienced it as betrayal. And that's when it clicked. Betrayal is what people call boundaries when they've benefited from your lack of them, and understanding that reframed the entire narrative. I wasn't the villain for stepping out of line, the line itself was abusive, and the more I held that truth, the less power their words had. Meanwhile, my life continued expanding in ways that felt almost suspicious at first, because I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. That call that would pull me back into crisis. But it didn't come. Instead, there were promotions and new friendships and the slow rebuilding of trust with myself. I started asking questions before saying yes, started pausing before offering help, started listening to my body when it tightened instead of overriding it with guilt. And those changes were subtle but profound. They shifted how I showed up everywhere, including Work where my assertiveness was suddenly noticed, not punished. And that created a new internal conflict because part of me still believed visibility was dangerous, that being seen would invite attack. But growth doesn't ask permission, it drags you forward anyway. And then came the moment that tested everything I'd learned. A family gathering invitation, not directly to me, but circulating through relatives, a holiday dinner framed as reconciliation. No apology, no acknowledgement, just an expectation of my presence to restore normalcy. And for a split second the old instinct flared. Maybe I should go, maybe this is the olive branch, maybe this is my chance to fix it. But then I read between the lines and saw what wasn't there any indication of change, any ownership of harm. It was a reset button, not a repair, and pressing reset would erase everything I'd fought to build. So I declined politely without explanation. And the fallout was immediate: whispers, accusations of coldness, dramatic interpretations of my silence. But I stayed quiet because silence is only cruel when it's used to control, when it's used to protect. It's necessary. And during that period I noticed something else happening. People began coming to me for advice, not because I positioned myself as an expert, but because I embodied a possibility. They asked how I stopped feeling guilty, how I held my ground, how I survived the backlash. And answering those questions forced me to articulate lessons I'd been learning instinctively, like how guilt is often the echo of old conditioning, not evidence of wrongdoing. How love that requires self-abandonment isn't love, it's leverage. How family loyalty shouldn't mean self-erasure. And teaching those lessons reinforced them in me. It made me more grounded, more certain. And certainty is the enemy of manipulation. My father continued reaching out sporadically, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes defensive, but always separate from my mother now. And while I didn't fully trust him, I allowed cautious connection because he was at least attempting to unlearn his silence. And that nuance mattered because not all harm is equal and not all repair looks the same. But even with him, I maintained boundaries because consistency isn't situational, it's foundational. And as my external world stabilized, my internal one did too. I stopped scanning for danger, stopped rehearsing conversations, stopped anticipating emotional ambushes. And that mental space created room for something unexpected: joy, not the performative kind, but the quiet satisfaction of living without fear of reprisal. And just when I thought the story might soften into resolution, another message arrived, one that shifted the entire trajectory again. It was from someone I didn't expect, a distant relative who'd been watching quietly, thanking me for saying what no one else had the courage to say, and confessing that my mother had done the same thing to others over the years, just on a smaller scale, using guilt and obligation to extract resources and compliance. And reading that message was like discovering my story was a chapter in a much larger book, that what happened to me wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. And patterns don't dissolve quietly, they resist exposure. And that exposure was coming faster than I realized because my anonymous writing had reached a point where anonymity was slipping. People were connecting dots, recognizing timelines. And with that recognition came risk, not just emotional but reputational. Because when you challenge a narrative built on appearances, the backlash intensifies, and I could feel it building in subtle ways: increased tension from family, increased scrutiny from acquaintances, increased attempts to discredit my perspective, and standing in that pressure required a new level of resolve. Not reactive, not defensive, but anchored. And one night, sitting alone in my new living room, I realized this phase wasn't about healing anymore, it was about ownership. Owning my voice, my story, my truth publicly if necessary, and that decision would have consequences not just for me but for everyone involved. Consequences I hadn't yet fully seen but could sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. And as I stared out at the city lights, I understood that the next step wouldn't just protect my future, it would redefine my past. Because once a story is told openly, it can't be rewritten behind closed doors. And the people who built their power on secrecy were about to lose their favorite weapon, whether they were ready or not. By the time I realized my name was no longer anonymous, it was already too late to pretend otherwise, because anonymity doesn't disappear with a knock, it evaporates in whispers, in screenshots forwarded without context, in someone recognizing a phrase you used at dinner and matching it to a paragraph they read at midnight when they couldn't sleep. And once that recognition happens, the story stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal for everyone involved, especially the people who benefited from you staying quiet. Because silence isn't neutral in a family like mine, it's structural. It's load-bearing. Remove it and the whole thing starts to sway. And that sway turned into visible panic faster than I expected. relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly checking in under the guise of concern, questions framed like care, but aimed like probes. Are you okay? Have you been stressed? Are you sure you're remembering things correctly? And every one of those questions carried the same implication that the problem wasn't what happened, it was my reaction to it, which is the oldest trick in the book when accountability threatens comfort. Shift the spotlight to the storyteller's sanity, and I could feel that old reflex stirring the urge to justify, to soften, to explain myself back into being palatable. But I didn't, because once you've named the pattern, you can't unsee it. And this was the pattern. Minimize the harm, maximize the disruption caused by naming it. So, instead of defending myself, I did something that felt reckless and grounding at the same time. I stopped responding to questions that weren't asked in good faith, not with anger, not with speeches, just with absence, because absence is powerful when it's chosen, and that absence forced people to sit with the discomfort they'd been outsourcing to me for years, and they hated it, especially my mother, who escalated from indirect tactics to overt ones when she realized I wasn't returning to the role. She showed up unannounced at my workplace one afternoon under the pretense of bringing lunch, smiling at the receptionist like she belonged there, and when I saw her through the glass walls of the lobby, something ancient and cold ran through me. Not fear, but recognition, because this was territory she'd never crossed before, and that meant she was desperate, and desperation makes people sloppy. I met her outside before she could go further, and her smile collapsed the moment we were alone. She accused me of turning the family against her, of airing dirty laundry, of exaggerating stories for attention, and I listened quietly because I wanted to hear how far she'd go, and she went far enough to threaten to tell my employer that I was unstable again, that I'd always been emotional, that I couldn't handle pressure, and in that moment something inside me finally snapped into place. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity, because this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was leverage, and leverage only works when the other person believes they need what you're offering, and I didn't anymore. So I told her calmly that if she contacted my employer, I would release the recordings and documentation publicly with timestamps and legal verification, not as a threat but as a consequence. And the shift in her expression was immediate because she understood leverage too. She'd been using it her whole life. And now she was staring at someone who'd learned the same language and wasn't afraid to speak it. She left without another word, and that was the last time she tried to confront me directly, but indirect pressure intensified instead. Rumors circulated that I was mentally unwell, that I'd always been dramatic, that I was exaggerating for sympathy, and I won't pretend that didn't hurt because it did, especially coming from people who'd known me since childhood. But pain doesn't always mean you're wrong. Sometimes it means you're touching something true, and truth disrupts ecosystems built on convenience. Around this time, my writing stopped being just cathartic and started becoming instructive. People asked how to document financial abuse, how to untangle shared accounts, how to set boundaries without escalating conflict, and I answered honestly, not as an expert, but as someone a few steps ahead on the same path. Explaining things like how to audit your own history without self-judgment, how to distinguish help from obligation, how to recognize when generosity has turned into expectation, and those conversations created a ripple effect because education is contagious when it's grounded in lived experience. And every message I received from someone who'd finally canceled a recurring transfer or said no for the first time reinforced my resolve. Because this wasn't just my story anymore, it was a mirror for thousands of people who'd been taught that love means sacrifice without limit. And then came the unexpected call that changed the stakes again. It was from an old family friend, someone who'd been present at that anniversary party but had left early, and they told me quietly that my mother had been telling a very different story since then, that she was portraying herself as the victim of a financially obsessed daughter who'd manipulated receipts and recordings, and worse, she was considering legal action not because she had a case but because she believed the threat alone would scare me back into compliance. And hearing that should have terrified me, but instead it clarified the endgame, because when someone escalates to legal intimidation without grounds, it means they're losing control of the narrative, and control was the only thing holding their world together. I consulted a lawyer not because I wanted to sue, but because I wanted to be prepared, and preparation is empowerment. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected, that my documentation was solid, that the recordings were admissible, that the financial records told a consistent story, and knowing that didn't make me feel triumphant, it made me feel steady. because steadiness is the opposite of the chaos they'd relied on. And then something unexpected happened again. My father reached out not to apologize, not to justify, but to warn me that my mother was spiraling, that she felt cornered, and was lashing out at anyone who didn't affirm her version of events. And hearing that stirred compassion I didn't expect but didn't act on, because compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice, and I told him that while I hoped she found support, it wouldn't be through me unless she was willing to acknowledge harm and change behavior, and he understood in a way he hadn't before because consequences had finally reached him too. And during this period, I noticed my body changing. The constant tension I'd lived with for years was easing. My sleep deepened, my appetite returned, my jaw unclenched. And that physical shift mattered because it reminded me that what I'd normalized as stress was actually survival, and survival mode is incompatible with growth. And growth was happening whether I was ready or not. Professionally, I was stepping into leadership roles that would have terrified the old me because leadership requires visibility, and visibility had always felt dangerous, but now it felt earned. And as my confidence grew, so did the contrast between who I was becoming and the version my family insisted I remained, and that dissonance created a final pressure point that would force a reckoning, because you can't keep someone small once they've outgrown the story you tell about them. And the reckoning came quietly at first with a letter from my mother, written not in anger, but in self-pity, describing how alone she felt, how misunderstood, how everything she'd done had been for the family. And reading it, I recognized the familiar pull to rescue, to reassure, to step back into the role of emotional regulator. But instead I read it as information about where she was stuck and what she wasn't willing to confront, and I didn't respond immediately because urgency is another manipulation tactic. And then something shifted publicly when a mutual acquaintance referenced my writing in a panel discussion about financial autonomy and family dynamics, crediting it anonymously but accurately. And suddenly the story had entered a broader conversation beyond family gossip, beyond personal grievance. It was now part of a cultural critique of how families exploit obligation, and that exposure changed the power dynamic completely, because once a story becomes representative, it can't be dismissed as isolated hysteria, and my mother sensed that too, because her next move was to attempt reconciliation publicly through social media, posting about forgiveness and healing without naming specifics, and that post triggered a flood of comments, some supportive, some questioning, some outright critical. And watching that unfold from a distance, I felt something like closure beginning to form, not because she'd changed, but because the mask was slipping without my involvement. And that's when I understood the most important lesson of this entire journey. You don't have to convince everyone, you just have to stop participating in the lie. The truth has a way of finding daylight when you step aside. And as I stepped aside further, focusing on my work, my friendships, my health, the noise faded into background static. But one unresolved thread remained: my sister, because unlike my parents, her behavior had been reckless, not calculated, and recklessness sometimes leaves room for growth. And one evening she reached out unexpectedly, not with accusations, not with demands, but with confusion, asking why everything had fallen apart so fast, why she was suddenly the villain in a story she thought was funny. And that question revealed how shallow her understanding had been, how little she'd considered consequences beyond her own amusement. And I responded carefully, explaining that harm doesn't require intent to be real, that sending that recording wasn't a prank, it was an act that exposed cruelty, and that accountability feels like punishment only when you've never had to face it before. And she didn't reply immediately, but days later she sent a message that surprised me: I didn't think it would go this far, I didn't think you'd actually leave. And that sentence encapsulated the entire dynamic. They never thought I'd leave, because leaving was never part of my assigned role. And realizing that wasn't empowering, it was sobering, because it meant the relationship had been built on an assumption of my endurance, not mutual care. And as I sat with that realization, I felt the weight of a choice approaching. A choice about whether to keep this story contained or to fully step into the role it had thrust upon me. Not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a witness. And witnessing carries responsibility, because once you've seen how systems of exploitation operate, you can't unknow it. And the next step would require more than boundaries, it would require visibility, the kind that invites both support and backlash. And as I prepared for that step, I knew the fallout would be bigger, louder, more public than anything before, but I also knew I was no longer afraid of losing a family that only existed as long as I paid for the privilege. And that freedom, the kind that comes after grief and clarity and choice, was something I wasn't willing to surrender again, not for anyone. The moment I agreed to step fully into visibility, everything accelerated in ways I couldn't have predicted, because exposure doesn't just attract support, it attracts resistance, opportunists, and people who see your story as a threat to their own carefully curated myths. And that became obvious the week after a regional business journal asked to interview me about financial boundaries and workplace resilience. A neutral angle on paper, but one that inevitably brushed against family dynamics. And I hesitated not because I was afraid of backlash, but because I understood leverage well enough by then to know that once something is public, it stops belonging to you alone. It becomes a mirror others project onto. But I also knew silence would keep enabling the same dynamics I was trying to dismantle, so I agreed on one condition: that the conversation focus on systems, not individuals, patterns, not names. And that boundary alone enraged my mother when she found out, because she wanted control over the narrative even if she wasn't mentioned, and control slips fastest when you're not in the room. The article came out on a Thursday morning, and by noon my inbox was flooded with messages from people who recognized themselves in the story. Accountants, teachers, nurses, engineers, people who'd quietly subsidized entire family ecosystems while being told they were selfish for wanting anything back. And reading those messages grounded me in something bigger than revenge or vindication. It grounded me in purpose. Because when your pain becomes a map for someone else's escape, it stops being just pain. But that same afternoon, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly: my mother's church friend, a woman who'd watched me grow up and once told me I was an example to the younger girls. And her tone was icy as she accused me of humiliating my parents publicly, of misrepresenting events, of tearing apart a family that had done nothing but support me. And I listened without interrupting because I wanted to hear how the story had been reframed, and when she finished I asked one question calmly: "Did you read the article, or did you hear about it from my mother?" Silence, then a defensive laugh. And that told me everything, because secondhand outrage is always louder than firsthand understanding. And after that call, I made a deliberate choice to stop engaging in debates about my experience with people who hadn't bothered to understand it, not out of spite but out of conservation. Because energy is a finite resource, and I'd already wasted years spending it where it wasn't valued. Around this time, my sister resurfaced again, not with apologies, but with confusion layered over resentment, asking why people were treating her differently, why friends had distanced themselves, why jokes she used to make now landed wrong. And I realized something important that I hadn't fully grasped before: accountability doesn't feel like growth to the person facing it feels like exile, and that discomfort is often mistaken for injustice. And I told her that the shift she was experiencing wasn't punishment, it was consequence. And that consequences are teachers, not enemies. Whether she chose to learn from them was up to her. She accused me of enjoying the fallout of basking in attention. And that accusation stung not because it was true, but because it echoed the narrative I'd been fed my whole life: that any assertion of self was vanity, that visibility was arrogance unless it served the family image. And I had to sit with that discomfort long enough to separate internalized guilt from actual harm. And that process wasn't glamorous. It was quiet nights, journaling, conversations I'd never have, therapy sessions, unpacking why I equated being liked with being safe. And slowly the urge to explain myself softened into something steadier, a confidence that didn't require consensus. Professionally, the momentum continued. I was invited to speak on a panel about financial literacy and ethical leadership. And standing on that stage, looking out at a room full of strangers, I felt something click into place, because for the first time my voice wasn't a liability, it was an asset. And I spoke not about my family, but about systems of obligation, how unspoken expectations distort relationships, how money becomes emotional currency when boundaries are absent. And the response was electric, because people crave language for experiences they've been told are ungrateful to name. After the panel, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes and said I thought I was the only one who felt like this. And that sentence alone justified every uncomfortable step that had brought me there. But even as my external world expanded, my internal world was still navigating unresolved grief. Because growth doesn't erase loss, it reframes it. And there were moments, especially late at night, when I missed the idea of my family, even knowing the reality. And I had to grieve not just people, but fantasies. The fantasy that love could be earned, the fantasy that patience would eventually be rewarded, the fantasy that silence was noble. Letting go of those illusions felt like losing home base, but it also freed me to build something new. And that building required deliberate choices about who I let close. I became more discerning about relationships, more attentive to reciprocity, less impressed by grand gestures and more by consistency, and that discernment paid off when I entered a new partnership, both personal and professional, with someone who understood boundaries as respect, not rejection, and being seen without being consumed was a revelation. Meanwhile, the situation with my parents reached an uneasy plateau. My father maintained limited contact marked by cautious honesty. My mother oscillated between martyrdom and rage depending on the audience. And I stopped tracking her narratives because monitoring someone else's distortion keeps you tethered to it. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my actions, my values, my next steps, and those steps included formalizing my writing into a platform, not as a brand but as a resource, something grounded, practical, unapologetically clear. And the response confirmed what I'd suspected: there is a massive unmet need for conversations about financial abuse that don't pathologize the victim or romanticize family loyalty. And as the platform grew, so did scrutiny. Skeptics accused me of exaggeration, of exploiting private matters for clout, and I welcomed those critiques selectively because skepticism sharpens truth when engaged honestly, but I refused to engage with attacks rooted in misogyny or moralizing about filial duty, because those arguments weren't about facts, they were about preserving hierarchies, and I'd had enough of that. The turning point came when a major publication reached out proposing a feature that would name names and dramatize the story for maximum impact, and I declined. Because I understood the difference between exposure and exploitation, between telling your story and selling it, and that decision infuriated my mother again because she believed publicity was something to be controlled, not refused, and her frustration manifested in a final attempt to reassert dominance through legal intimidation, a cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation. And receiving that letter was surreal because it confirmed everything I'd been saying, that the priority wasn't the truth or repair, was silence. But this time I didn't panic. I forwarded it to my attorney, who responded with a concise factual rebuttal, attaching documentation and inviting further action, and the silence that followed was deafening, because bullies retreat when confronted with evidence and resolve, and that retreat marked a psychological shift for me, because it was the moment I realized the threat was over, not because they'd changed, but because I'd changed. I was no longer operating from fear or appeasement, and that internal shift altered every interaction that followed. I stopped anticipating backlash, stopped rehearsing defenses, stopped explaining myself preemptively, and the calm that replaced that vigilance was profound. Not euphoric, but grounded. And in that groundedness, I began planning the next chapter, not as a reaction, but as an intention, outlining projects, collaborations, mentorship opportunities that aligned with my values. And as I mapped those plans, I understood that the story wasn't ending, it was evolving, moving from exposure to integration, from rupture to reconstruction. And reconstruction is quieter but more demanding because it requires consistency, not adrenaline. And as I stepped into that phase, I knew the most difficult part was still ahead: not confronting them, but fully trusting myself. Trusting that I could build a life that wasn't defined by opposition but by alignment. And that trust would be tested in subtle ways, in moments of doubt, in the temptation to re-engage old patterns when loneliness crept in. And navigating those tests would require vigilance and compassion in equal measure. But for the first time, the path forward felt like mine to choose, not something negotiated or rationed or earned through sacrifice. And that sense of ownership was intoxicating and terrifying and necessary. Because once you've reclaimed your agency, you can't go back to being a supporting character in someone else's story. And the next steps would demand even more courage, not to expose but to sustain, to build something lasting from the rubble of what collapsed. And that rebuilding would bring its own revelations, its own conflicts, its own unexpected allies and adversaries. Because growth doesn't happen in isolation, it happens in relationship. And those relationships would test whether I truly believed the lessons I'd learned, or just liked the clarity they provided. And as I prepared to take that leap, I understood that the real reckoning wasn't behind me, it was unfolding, and the choices I made next would determine whether the story remained a moment of rupture or became a foundation. And that question lingered as both challenge and invitation, urging me forward into a chapter that would demand everything I'd gained and more. The strange thing about finally stepping into a life that no longer required permission was how quiet it felt at first. Not empty, not lonely, just unfamiliar, because chaos had been such a constant companion that peace felt like a foreign language. And I had to relearn how to listen to myself without scanning for someone else's approval in the background. And that recalibration didn't happen overnight. It happened in moments, like the first morning I woke up and realized I hadn't checked my phone for messages from my parents, hadn't braced myself for disappointment, hadn't rehearsed explanations in the shower, and instead I made coffee, stood by the window, and noticed the city moving without me needing to prove anything to it. And that's when it hit me that freedom isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just removes the weight you forgot you were carrying. And the days that followed weren't dramatic, but they were decisive, because every choice I made, without consulting guilt, rewired something inside me. Every yes that came from alignment instead of obligation, every no that didn't come with a justification, every boundary that didn't collapse under pressure, and I started seeing patterns with clarity I'd never had before, like how often love had been framed as sacrifice, how loyalty had been measured by how much I was willing to lose, how generosity had been weaponized into expectation. And once you see that you can't unsee it, you can't go back to calling extraction care or manipulation concern, and that clarity didn't just apply to my family, it applied everywhere. To work relationships that thrived on my overfunctioning, to friendships that only reached out when they needed emotional labor, to habits that kept me busy so I wouldn't have to feel. And one by one I audited my life the same way I'd audited my finances, asking what gives return, what drains value, what compounds growth, and what quietly bankrupts you over time. And that process was ruthless in the best way, because it wasn't driven by anger anymore. It was driven by self-respect, and respect changes the rules of the game entirely, because when you respect yourself, you stop negotiating with people who benefit from your silence. You stop explaining your worth to people who profit from your doubt, and you stop confusing endurance with virtue. And that shift showed up in unexpected places, like when my mother tried one last time to reopen contact under the guise of reconciliation, using softer language, selective memory, carefully edited remorse, and for the first time I didn't feel pulled toward fixing it. I felt still, I listened, I acknowledged without agreeing, I declined without attacking, and when the call ended I didn't shake, didn't spiral, didn't second-guess, I just went on with my day. And that's when I understood that healing isn't the absence of contact, it's the absence of control. It's when someone can no longer hijack your nervous system. And that realization unlocked something deeper, because if you've lived your whole life being managed by the fear of losing love, then choosing yourself feels like betrayal until you realize you were never betraying anyone. You were just refusing to keep betraying yourself. And I want to pause right here and ask you something, because if you're still listening, there's a reason. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What country? What time is it for you? Because stories like this don't land by accident. They land because somewhere in you there's recognition, and I want you to feel seen in this moment too. Not talked at, not lectured, just included, because the next part of this isn't about me anymore. It's about what happens after the dust settles, when the applause fades, when the outrage cools, when the story stops being viral and starts being lived, because that's where most people get stuck. They survive the break but don't know how to build after, and building is harder than exposing, because it requires consistency without adrenaline. It requires patience without applause. It requires making peace with the fact that some people will always believe the version of you that made them most comfortable, and you have to let them. You have to let them, because correcting every lie costs more than letting the truth live quietly in your actions. And that was the lesson that reshaped everything for me. That I didn't need universal understanding, I needed internal congruence. And once I had that, the rest became noise. Even the occasional pang of grief that still surfaced when I saw families laughing together or holidays that looked effortless, because grief doesn't disappear when you choose better. It just changes shape. It becomes something you carry with dignity instead of something that controls you. And there were nights I mourned the parents I wished I had, the sister I thought I knew, the version of family that only existed in my head. And instead of numbing that sadness, I let it exist, because honoring grief is how you keep it from turning into bitterness. And bitterness is the final trap. It's the one that convinces you you're free, while keeping you chained to the past. And I refused that. I refused to let my future be a reaction to their failures. I wanted it to be a response to my values, and that's when everything aligned. My work deepened, my relationships sharpened, my sense of self solidified, not as a brand or an identity but as a baseline, a quiet knowing of who I was without needing to perform. And opportunities started showing up, not because I chased them, but because I was finally visible to the right ones. And that's something no one tells you. When you stop contorting yourself to be acceptable, you become recognizable, and recognition attracts resonance. not everyone, but the right ones, and those connections built something sustainable, something rooted, something that didn't depend on me shrinking to survive. And as that life took shape, I stopped measuring success by what I'd escaped and started measuring it by what I was creating. And creation is the ultimate form of closure because it doesn't erase the past, it transcends it. And if you're wondering whether they ever truly understood, whether there was a moment of full accountability, a cinematic apology, a final admission of wrongdoing, the honest answer is no, not in the way movies promise. But here's the truth that matters more. Their understanding was never required for my healing. Their remorse was never the missing piece. The missing piece was my permission to move forward without waiting for them to catch up. And once I gave myself that permission, everything else fell into place, not perfectly, not painlessly, but authentically. And authenticity is the most powerful form of peace there is, because it can't be taken from you. And if there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this. You don't owe anyone your silence to preserve their comfort. You don't owe anyone access to you because they share your blood, and you don't owe your past the rest of your life just because it took so much from you. What you owe yourself is honesty, boundaries, and the courage to build something better even when it scares you, especially when it scares you. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you angry or sad or relieved or seen, don't ignore that. Sit with it, talk about it, write it down, share it with someone who needs permission to choose themselves too. Because stories like this don't end when the video stops, they continue in the lives of the people who hear them and decide to do something different. And if you're not ready yet, that's okay. Readiness isn't a requirement for truth, but when you are, know this: you are not too sensitive, you are not selfish for wanting respect, and you are not wrong for walking away from people who only loved what they could take. And what comes next for you doesn't have to look like revenge or reconciliation. It can look like freedom, and freedom isn't loud, it's steady, it's yours, and it's waiting.